While questions have been raised over security and safety in the United States following the assassination bid on the former President Donald Trump, we've spoken to Professor Salvatore Babones, who is an American sociologist. Listen in. Country that calls itself a superpower. This is the former U.S. president, somebody who's a presidential nominee, and shots being fired at him. What do you make of the information that has come in till now on this assassination bid?
Unfortunately, violence is part of the American political scene and has been for more than 200 years. Now, none of us condone or accept that, but that is a reality of the situation. In addition, there's a lot of highly inflammatory political language. It was President Biden himself who less than a week ago said we have to put a bullseye on Donald Trump. Now, of course, he meant that metaphorically. He was not calling on somebody to assassinate Donald Trump. But this kind of rhetoric is fairly typical in the United States, and it does potentially inspire those who, well, are obviously, a little too passionate and have a poor grasp of reality to take actions like this.
That's right. But what do you make of the security lapses here? Because the far rooftop is an obvious firing range, and there are some of the eyewitnesses who have speaking about the threat. The Secret Service officials were present there, but they acted on time, you could say, because Donald Trump was only injured, but they did not work on time enough to completely stop the shooter. What do you say of the lapses that can very clearly be seen in the incident?
Obviously, I'm not a security expert, and I can't give any kind of definitive answer to that. There have been suggestions in the press that the Trump campaign had asked for additional security, but none of us know whether the security was appropriate. We also know that members of the crowd were, for at least a minute before the shooting, pointing at the shooter on a rooftop, but it appears, again, from what we've heard from eyewitness accounts, that although people in the crowd could see that person on the rooftop, the Secret Service and the police could not see that person on the rooftop. I think we all don't know enough to really make any kind of definitive judgment here, except to say that obviously there has been a failure of security, and we have to hope that security will be improved.
Okay, a gun culture has been spoken of during the U.S. presidential elections for time immemorial. What is the impact you think this incident, the firing at Donald Trump, is going to have on the elections?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question at all.
Professor Babones, the talk on gun culture in the United States has been an issue that has been spoken of time and again, and Republicans have also spoken in favor of it. But this is an incident involving Donald Trump. How do you think that the U.S. elections are going to shape up after this incident?
Gun violence in the United States really has very little to do with this assassination attempt. This seems to have been someone who was a relatively professional sniper. I mean, he came very close to shooting the president smack in the forehead. This has almost nothing to do with the kinds of gun control we hear about in the U.S., which are about violence in American cities and primarily in African American and other minority neighborhoods in the United States. So this has very little to do with the gun control narrative in the United States. As far as how it affects the broader election, obviously, there's going to be an immediate outpouring of sympathy for Donald Trump. We don't know how that will play out in the next few months. I think key to that will be how Joe Biden reacts to it. It really is now up to President Biden to take a mature stance in dealing with this, and it's a difficult circle for him to square. Obviously, he expressed his sympathy and his hopes that everyone will improve. That's what he had to do. But the extent to which he will be able to manage this issue going forward, well, it's going to be very challenging, to say the least.
Okay, so do you see this as a turning point in the elections, the U.S. elections?
No, it's not a turning point. It reinforces the Trump momentum. That is, the Trump brand over the past 6 months to a year has been built on defiance to authority, and that defiance to authority has made him a hero to many Americans. Remember, the United States is a country that was founded on defiance to authority. Now, President Biden has in the past repeatedly called Donald Trump a thug, using, I know that term originates in India, but most Americans won't be aware of that, and most Americans hear that term thug as meaning a criminal, a hoodlum, somebody who's on the wrong side of the law. Well, for Americans, just think of our history of Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Old West gunfighters. I mean, being that kind of someone who defies authority is romanticized in the United States. So it merely plays into the accumulating persona of Donald Trump as someone who's defying the American political establishment in a kind of final showdown in November between a populist resurgence on his part or led by him and an establishment that is attempting to keep him out of the White House.
And, what do you think of Trump's response and his administration's response to the shooting incident and how that's going to shape up his public image and approval ratings? In fact, one picture that has gone really viral is of Donald Trump just moments after the attack where he's seen with his fist in the air.
Oh, that's a fantastic image. It is going to be the defining image of the campaign. We all thought that the Trump mugshot would be the defining image of the campaign, and now here is one that is even more, more in the spirit of heroic defiance against a political machine that has attempted to crush him. Interestingly, the anti-Trump media cropped the American flag out of that photo. So, for example, the New York Times ran at the top of its page that photo, but with the American flag cut off and with a still from the video taken 1 moment earlier that showed Trump scowling instead of Trump, breaking out into. Instead of showing Trump in a spirit of exultation. So it's, even the New York Times, the anti-Trump media was very well aware of the power of that image, and it will be shown again and again. It's already received probably millions of views on Twitter, and it will become the defining image of the campaign.
Right, and I was just going through your Twitter timeline. You've also criticized the U.S. media on their coverage of the shooting on Donald Trump.
Yes, the New York Times has been the worst. Other U.S. media like CNN initially reported that Trump had fallen instead of reporting that he had been shot. There's a strong resistance in the establishment American media to concede anything when it comes to Donald Trump. And so even an assassination attempt was reported by the New York Times as a quote-unquote possible assassination attempt. And that wasn't 5 hours ago. That's 50 minutes ago. It was reported as a possible. The whole world knows there was an assassination attempt. It's ridiculous for the New York Times and for other establishment media outlets to attempt to spin this as anything else than what it was. Yet they still can't give up the narrative, or still can't give up the attempt to control the narrative about these sort of events. Everybody knows that this was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump. This wasn't a random shooting. This wasn't a situation where the shooter on the rooftop actually wanted to kill a woman behind Trump and accidentally grazed his ear while doing so. It's obvious to everyone this was an assassination attempt. So it's somewhat pathetic of the New York Times not to be willing to admit that.
Absolutely. But the media and the coverage of the incident is also an indication of how polarized and how divided U.S. politics has made the entire country. So with this incident, do you see that only increasing?
Of course, that's true, and it is a symptom of the polarization. That said, call a spade a spade. I mean, even if you don't like the news that's coming out, it's ridiculous to try to spin it as anything other than what it literally is. And unfortunately, we see that now as being very common in the U.S. media. In fact, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I actually turned to Indian media for 24-hour coverage of the invasion of Ukraine, because I felt that U.S. media on any side could not be taken seriously. Now, ultimately, the facts do come out in the U.S. media, so the attempt is to control the headline with the idea that, a week later, no one will notice. Or in the case of the Hunter Biden laptop phenomenon. 2 years later, the New York Times and Washington Post finally admit that it was real. These sorts of shenanigans are not becoming to serious media professionals. And unfortunately, the U.S. media, not only on the anti-Trump side, but also the limited number of pro-Trump U.S. media outlets, have become essentially elements of the political parties they are reporting on. They are now essentially party propaganda outlets.
Okay, all right. But when we speak of the elections, Professor, you're saying that the shooting incident is not going to put the Republican Party's change in stance. You don't think that's going to happen, a change in the Republican Party's stance?
The meme that is going around is that Donald Trump just won the election, and I just think that these sorts of emotional moments don't carry over for a period of months. I mean, for an example from the Indian context, just think about the euphoria in India about the opening of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, and a few months later, it had no effect on the Indian elections. The same thing will be true of this sort of emotional moment. Yes, it reinforces the Trump campaign's narrative. It will be an advantage to the Trump campaign, but it certainly doesn't decide the election. In a week, we'll be talking about, once again, the politically more important question of what happens to the Biden presidency, and does Joe Biden continue the campaign or step aside?
Okay, all right. We'll come back to that. But you're saying that this will not force Trump to take a stand against open sale of guns in the United States?
Oh, no, absolutely not. This will not be viewed certainly not by Donald Trump in the context of gun control. Donald Trump and his support base thoroughly support the possession of firearms by American citizens. This will be seen as a criminal act, not as an artifact of it being too easy to get guns in the United States.
Okay. Professor, just to circle back to what you had said on the increased support for Donald Trump, Elon Musk is somebody who has not openly spoken out in support of Donald Trump, but he has often alluded to it. He has tweeted about the incident, though he says extreme incompetence, or was it deliberate? He has also tweeted that picture that we spoke of where Donald Trump is seen with that U.S. flag right behind him. So do you see this as an outpouring of support that will continue to come in for Donald Trump?
Many prominent people have now come out to support Donald Trump, but they were moving towards that anyway. That is to say, Donald Trump 2 years ago was viewed almost as an anathema among most mainstream Americans, certainly by tech millionaires and such. They might secretly support him, but they wouldn't say anything publicly because they thought it would harm their own reputations. Now it has become socially acceptable, at least in broader circles in the United States, to endorse Donald Trump. So I think we're seeing people who may have secretly supported Donald Trump now being more willing to express their support. And this assassination attempt will, I think, reinforce that trend. But remember, Trump fundraising was already on an upward trajectory well before this event. As Trump became the acknowledged Republican Party candidate for 2024 with no serious opposition, well, all of that reluctance to engage with Trump faded away. There were many people, especially wealthy people in the United States, who were hoping that there would be a Republican Party alternative to Donald Trump. There was large-scale support among American elites for Rick DeSantis, despite not among Democratic Party elites, but among Republican elites for Rick DeSantis, the governor of Florida. That all, once that faded away, once the DeSantis campaign became unrealistic, that support has shifted to Donald Trump. And I think we shouldn't read more into that than simply the natural shift of U.S. politics. It may sound strange to hear a pundit remarking this way, but the fact is that the Donald Trump candidacy is much more a normal American presidential candidacy than anyone seems to want to acknowledge.
Okay, all right. Lastly, I want to ask you, just to sum it up, what do you think are the things to look at now as things proceed? Is it going to be the response of the Trump administration? Is it going to be how Joe Biden responds? Or, what do you think is going to be the significant factors going forward now?
Well, Donald Trump will obviously make hay out of this, and he will appear very soon, this week at the Republican National Convention on a huge national stage. Joe Biden will presumably not make a big deal of this other than to express his condolences until after Trump has his big moment at the convention in Milwaukee. The real question, though, is how Joe Biden reacts after the convention. It'll be very difficult for Joe Biden to continue to give speeches in which he calls Donald Trump a threat to democracy. That has been the standard campaigning position of Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. Now they'll have to be more circumspect in their language. And the new narrative that the Democratic Party arrives at will define the rest of this campaign. At this point, it's wait and see.
Okay, all right. So what will be the new narrative? What happens going forward will be very, very interesting to see. Professor Salvatore Babones, thank you so much for joining us on the broadcast with your perspective.